So if you look at the United States between the 1960s and the year 2000, high school graduation rates just absolutely skyrocketed.
Oh, completely. It was a massive boom.
Right, like an unprecedented boom in the number of adults who actually had a diploma in their hands. Millions more people sitting through, civics classes, reading American history, basically learning the actual mechanics of democracy.
Which is what we want, right?
Exactly. By every traditional metric we have, the American public became vastly more educated during that window. But, and here's the crazy part, if you look at what happened at the ballot box during that exact same time, the numbers completely fall off a cliff.
Yeah, it's honestly a jarring contrast.
It really is. I mean, in the 1960 presidential election, voter turnout was at 63%. But by the 1996 election, it had plummeted to just 49%.
Which is a huge drop.
Massive. So the polls were basically emptying out while the graduation stages were just packed with people.
And that is a profound historical divergence. I mean, you have two lines on a graph that, according to literally everything we are taught, should be moving up together.
Right.
But instead, they're just violently pulling apart.
And that completely shatters this fundamental myth we tell ourselves about society. Because for centuries, we've been told that a well-educated populace is the absolute bedrock of a functioning democracy.
Right, the whole school builds citizens idea.
Exactly. If you want better citizens, you put them in a classroom. But the math from that 40-year period is just completely broken. I mean, if more education automatically equals better citizens who participate more, why did this massive surge in high school graduates result in a massive collapse in voting?
And that glaring contradiction is the whole catalyst for our deep dive today.
It really is.
Because we are looking at this paradigm-shifting 2004 study. It's from the Journal of Public Economics, and it's titled, Does Education Improve Citizenship? Evidence from the United States and the United Kingdom.
Such a good paper.
It's incredible. We have this towering stack of data crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and our mission today is to just strip away all the comforting assumptions we have about school and civic duty.
Yes, we are getting into the raw numbers.
Exactly. We're going to look at raw, unfiltered behavioral data to see if staying in school actually makes you a better citizen, or if we have literally just been running our entire public policy on a fairy tale.
I love that. And I want to set the stakes for this because this assumption, that school builds citizens is not just some modern political talking point.
Oh, no, not at all.
This idea is baked into the absolute foundation of Western democratic thought. Like, if you walk up to the Boston Public Library, there's literally a massive inscription carved in stone above the doors. It says, "The Commonwealth requires the education of the people as the safeguard of order and liberty."
It is treated as absolute gospel. You can trace that exact sentiment through, honestly, completely opposed economic philosophies.
I could.
Well, you have Adam Smith writing back in 1776, right? He's looking at this highly volatile pre-industrial society.
Right, early days.
Yeah, and he argues that if you educate the common people, they are less apt to be misled into unnecessary destructive opposition to the government. They actually become a stabilizing force.
Okay, so that's Adam Smith.
Right. And then you leap forward to the 20th century and you have someone like Milton Friedman.
A guy who is definitely not known for wanting massive government interventions.
Far from it. I mean, he was a massive advocate for the most limited possible role of the state. And yet, even Friedman argued that a stable, democratic society is completely impossible to maintain without a minimum widespread degree of literacy and knowledge.
So even the ultimate free market guy says, we need schools for democracy to work.
Exactly. The core argument is that education isn't just about the individual getting a better job. It provides what economists refer to as positive externalities.
Okay, let me put that in real-world terms for you, the listener.
Yeah.
A positive externality is basically a collateral benefit. It's when a transaction between two parties creates a massive benefit for a third party who had literally nothing to do with it. So you go to school, you put in the work, you get a degree, and you personally earn a higher salary. That is your private return.
Your own personal reward.
Exactly. But the Adam Smith and Milton Friedman argument is that your education actually benefits me, your neighbor.
Yes.
It makes you a more informed voter. It makes you less likely to fall for a corrupt politician's lies. It means you might show up to a city council meeting and stop a terrible zoning law. Basically, I benefit from your time in the classroom.
And that collateral benefit is the entire justification for public, taxpayer-funded education.
Right. Why else would we pay for it?
Exactly. It's why a society is willing to spend billions of dollars subsidizing schools for children that aren't even their own. We are paying for the creation of good citizens.
Which makes sense on paper.
It does. But when you look back at that plunging voter turnout in the late 20th century, that foundational theory looks like it is entirely divorced from reality.
It really does. So we have an incredible mystery to solve today. But right out of the gate, we run into a massive structural problem with the data.
Correlation trap.
Yes. How do you actually prove that a diploma makes someone vote? Because the old way of looking at this is completely flawed. You can't just open a spreadsheet, see that wealthy college graduates in the suburbs vote more often than high school dropouts struggling to pay rent, and conclude that the college degree is the magic ingredient.
You absolutely cannot make that leap. That is the classic statistical trap of confusing correlation with causation.
Because their lives, their backgrounds, their environments are entirely different.
Immensely different. And this is the fatal flaw in decades of older political science research. Let's just build a scenario here.
Okay, lay it out.
Imagine a household where the parents are deeply engaged in their local community. They discuss current events at the dinner table, they volunteer, they read the newspaper every morning.
The classic engaged family.
Right. And crucially, they place a massive cultural value on academic success. They push their child to excel.
Okay, so that kid grows up, gets a master's degree, and naturally votes in every single local and national election.
Yes. But here is the critical question for a researcher. Did the master's degree actually cause that person to become a voter?
I see what you're saying.
Right. Or did the invisible unobserved factor, which is the parents' heavy influence, cause both the high educational attainment and the high civic participation?
Wow, yeah. The education might just be a byproduct of the exact same upbringing that created the voting habit.
Exactly. Without a way to isolate the actual time spent in the classroom, any connection you draw is just a mirage. It proves literally nothing about cause and effect.
I am so glad you laid it out like that because it highlights how impossible this puzzle seems at first glance. I mean, to truly prove that the classroom time is what changes the citizen, you would have to run a wildly unethical science fiction experiment.
Oh, it would be a nightmare.
Right. You would have to take a massive group of kids, magically erase their parents' influence, forcefully lock half of those kids in a school building for an extra year against their will, let the other half leave, change absolutely nothing else about their environments, and then track them down 30 years later to see which group votes more.
It sounds like a dystopian novel.
It really sounds like treating human beings like civic lab rats.
It does. But the brilliant foundational move of the researchers behind this 2004 study is that they didn't have to invent that dystopian experiment.
Because it already happened.
Exactly. They realized that governments across the United States and the United Kingdom had already run that exact experiment on millions of people entirely by accident over the course of the 20th century.
I love when history just hands us the perfect test.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through the mechanics of this. How did the government accidentally create the perfect scientific control group?
They did it by continuously changing compulsory schooling laws. In economics, when we are desperate to prove causation, but we obviously can't run a randomized clinical trial on human lives, we hunt for an external shock.
Like a sudden rule change.
Yes. We look for a moment when a massive, arbitrary outside force suddenly changed the rules for a specific group of people, completely independent of their personal backgrounds, their ambition, or their parents' wealth.
And in this case, the external shock was the law. Politicians literally moving the goalposts on when a kid was legally allowed to drop out of school.
Precisely that. Let's look at the incredible historical data they pulled from the United Kingdom. If you rewind to the early 20th century in Great Britain, a staggering fraction of British children dropped out of the education system the absolute second they were legally permitted to do so.
Which was incredibly young back then, right?
Age 14.
Wow.
Think about a 14-year-old today. In 1935 Great Britain, over 60% of all 14-year-olds dropped out of school immediately to enter the workforce, go to the factories, or just help run the household.
60% of an entire generation just halting their formal education as young teenagers. That is wild.
It really is. But then the landscape shifts. You have the aftermath of World War II, a massive push for societal rebuilding, and Parliament passes the 1944 Education Act.
So what did that act actually do?
It mandated a nationwide increase in the minimum school leaving age from 14 to 15. Because of the post-war chaos, it took a few years to get the infrastructure ready, but the law officially slammed into effect in 1947.
Okay, think about what that actually means on the ground for a second. If you happen to turn 14 in 1946, you could blow out your birthday candles, pack up your desk, and leave school forever. You were free.
Yep, done with school.
But if your younger brother turned 14 just 1 year later, in 1947, he tries to pack up his desk, and the government steps in and says, no, sit back down. You are legally required to stay in this building for another 365 days?
That is exactly the dynamic. The researchers call it a sharp discontinuity. The data shows a spectacular cliff. The fraction of 14-year-olds leaving school dropped from 51% in 1946 down to under 10% just 2 years later.
That is a massive swing.
Huge. You have this massive cohort of teenagers who, based on historical trends, desperately wanted to drop out. They had the exact same lack of intrinsic motivation, the exact same working-class family backgrounds as the kids a year older than them, but the law forced them to endure an extra year of formal education.
And didn't the UK run this exact same playbook a few decades later?
They ran it again in 1972. They bumped the minimum age up from 15 to 16.
And I'm guessing it had the same effect.
We see the exact same statistical cliff. The dropout rate at age 15 plummeted from about 30% down to under 10%.
Wow.
And as a fascinating historical footnote, Northern Ireland actually delayed their implementation of the first change, the jump from 14 to 15, due to a lack of local political cooperation. They didn't implement it until 1957.
So basically 10 years later.
Right. And you see the exact same sharp drop in dropouts happen 10 years later in Northern Ireland.
That is the beauty of this kind of data. It isolates the variable perfectly.
Yeah.
You take motivation out of the equation completely. These kids didn't choose to read more history or do more math. The state compelled them.
Completely forced.
So we can look at them decades later, compare them to the kids who barely escaped the law a year earlier, and know for an absolute fact that any difference in their voting habits is purely causally the result of that forced extra year in the classroom.
That is the power of the natural experiment. It's beautiful.
Now, I want to cross the ocean because the United States is always a different beast when it comes to legal standardization. I am assuming the U.S. didn't have one clean, nationwide law that trapped everybody at their desks at the exact same time.
Oh, not at all. The United States system is a patchwork of localized chaos.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Throughout the entire period from 1914 to 1990, individual states were continuously tinkering with their compulsory attendance levels and their child labor laws. And keep in mind, child labor laws function as a secondary school leaving law.
Because they dictate the earliest age a child can legally enter the labor market.
Exactly. If you can't legally work, you're usually staying in school.
So you have 50 different states changing their laws in 50 different years.
Exactly. Sometimes raising the required age and in some very dark historical moments, actually lowering it.
Wait, I want to push back on that. Why on earth would a state actively choose to lower the compulsory education age? What is the political incentive for making your state less educated?
It's pretty bleak. The most dramatic examples occurred in the American South, specifically South Carolina and Mississippi during the Civil Rights era.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Following the federal mandates for the racial integration of public schools, those states actually repealed their compulsory attendance statutes entirely.
You are kidding me.
No, the specific calculated goal was to avoid requiring white children to attend racially mixed schools.
Wow. That is incredibly heavy. So they essentially burned down the requirement for public education rather than integrate it.
They did. Now, South Carolina eventually reenacted their compulsory attendance laws a decade later, but riddled them with loopholes.
Unbelievable.
I bring this up just to highlight just how volatile, localized, entirely independent of a student's personal ambition these laws were. But for our researchers, this massive, chaotic web of changing state laws is actually a statistical goldmine.
Because it creates thousands of tiny natural experiments across the country instead of just one big one.
Right. By looking at the exact state a person lived in when they were 14 and the exact year they turned 14, the researchers can calculate precisely how many years of schooling they were legally forced to endure before they had the option to leave.
So smart.
They filter out the chosen education, the people who went on to get master's degrees because they wanted to, and isolate only the raw foundational years of forced education.
So the trap is set. The methodology is bulletproof. We have isolated the exact causal mechanism of forced schooling, independent of whether your parents cared about your grades.
We have.
But before we reveal if that extra forced schooling actually forged better voters, we have to deal with a massive, uncomfortable flaw in human nature.
The survey problem. It is a massive hurdle in the social sciences.
Because here's the harsh reality. What if everything we have assumed about the educated voter is based on a collective, societal lie?
People lie all the time on surveys.
Right. Think about your own behavior as a listener. If a researcher calls you up on a Tuesday night and asks, "Did you perform your civic duty and vote in the last election?" There's a crushing psychological weight to say yes.
Oh, absolutely. It is deeply ingrained in us. Voting is universally framed as the baseline of being a good citizen.
Right.
In survey methodology, this is called the social desirability bias. When asked about a behavior society views favorably, respondents routinely over-report their participation.
They lie to save face.
Exactly. Even if they spent election day sitting on the couch binge-watching television, they will tell a stranger on the phone that they voted.
Because nobody wants to admit to a researcher that they are lazy or apathetic.
Highly embarrassed.
Yeah.
And the critical issue for our deep dive today is that for decades, leading political scientists assumed this embarrassment was not distributed equally across society.
Really? How so?
The prevailing academic theory, heavily supported by papers published in the 80s and 90s, was that highly educated people feel this social pressure far more intensely than anyone else.
Okay, I can actually see the logic behind that. If you are a high school dropout struggling with 2 manual labor jobs, you might feel entirely disconnected from the political system, so admitting you didn't vote doesn't really sting as much.
Right. You don't feel like the system belongs to you anyway.
Exactly. But if you have a college degree, you probably consider yourself an engaged, upstanding pillar of the community. You have read the history. You know you are supposed to vote. So the shame of missing an election is magnified.
That makes sense intuitively.
Right, so therefore, the theory goes, you are far more likely to lie to the surveyor.
That was the widely accepted assumption. The educated elites are lying to protect their self-image. And if that assumption is true, it is an absolute disaster for the data.
It ruins everything.
It completely destroys the premise of the study. If a raw survey shows an 80% turnout for college graduates and a 50% turnout for high school dropouts, the actual reality might be a 50% turnout for both groups.
But the college graduates are just lying through their teeth by a margin of 30%.
Exactly.
It would mean the entire connection between education and voting is just a statistical mirage created by people trying to sound smart on the phone. So how did the researchers untangle this? Because you can't just ask a survey respondent, "Hey, were you lying a second ago?" They will just lie again.
No, you absolutely cannot take their word for it. The researchers realized they had to bypass human testimony entirely. So they utilized a remarkably labor-intensive feature of the National Election Studies, or the NES, dataset.
Okay, what did they do?
For a select number of election years between 1964 and 1990, the administrators of the NES didn't just write down what the respondents said they did. They took the answers, and they went out into the real world to cross-reference them with actual official government voting records.
Oh, wow. And think about the era this is happening in, 1964 to 1990. We are not talking about running a quick script against a national digital database. We're talking about physical bureaucratic validation.
It was an immense undertaking.
They had to actually go look at paper records.
Yes. The survey administrators literally checked the official county registries in the local jurisdictions where the respondents lived. If the respondent claimed they were registered back in their home county 3 states over, the administrators made long-distance phone calls to those distant, dusty municipal offices to manually check the ledgers.
That is wild.
They painstakingly, one by one, validated the true voting status of these individuals against the official logs maintained by the government.
They basically pull the receipts. It is the ultimate lie detector test.
And the results of this validation process completely obliterate the conventional wisdom. It is an absolute slap in the face to decades of political science assumptions about who lies and why.
This is one of those counterintuitive findings that I absolutely love. Okay, lay it on me. Do the educated elites lie more? Do they hyperinflate their voting records to look good?
They do not.
Not at all.
In fact, when you look at the rate of misreporting, people who didn't vote but claimed they did, the rate is remarkably flat across the bottom 3 tiers of educational attainment. Whether you are a high school dropout, a high school graduate, or someone who attended a few years of college, you lie to the survey at roughly the exact same rate. In those groups, about 18 to 20% of the non-voters will look the surveyor in the eye and falsely claim they cast a ballot.
Okay, so roughly 1 in 5 people without a 4-year degree are lying to save face. What happens when we look at the people with a bachelor's degree or higher, the people who supposedly feel the most intense social shame?
For college graduates, the lie rate actually drops. Only 14% of non-voting college graduates misreported their behavior.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. The lie rate drops. The group we assumed was inflating the numbers the most is actually the most honest.
The lie rate drops. The researchers analyzed this validated data across multiple decades, from the 60s all the way into the 90s, and the gradient is completely flat, or tilting slightly downward as education increases. College graduates are statistically the most truthful group when it comes to admitting their actual voting history.
That completely flips the script. Why did the older political scientists get this so wrong for so long? How do you make a mistake that big in your academic models?
The researchers of our current 2004 study point out exactly where the older studies went off the rails. It comes down to a methodological error in how you frame the denominator.
Okay, explain that.
Older studies isolated only the validated non-voters and calculated what percentage of them lied. But if college graduates vote at massively higher rates anyway, your pool of non-voting college grads is incredibly small and strange to begin with.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Our researchers looked at the entire sample voters and non-voters combined to see if the overall measurement error of the entire group was correlated with education. And it simply isn't. The misreporting is essentially random noise spread across the education spectrum.
So the data is bulletproof. The lies have been filtered out and mathematically neutralized. The causal link has been rigorously established through the compulsory schooling laws we talked about earlier. We finally have a clean environment to answer the core question: does an extra year of education actually force you to become a more active voter?
And this is where a transatlantic comparison reveals a mechanism of voter suppression that is so deeply ingrained in the system we barely even notice it.
Listeners, brace yourselves. If you think an extra year of high school automatically rewires your brain into a voting machine, the difference between the U.S. data and the UK data is going to give you absolute whiplash.
It really is. Let's start with the raw, unconditional contrast between the two countries. In the United States, the gap in voting between the educated and the uneducated is a canyon.
Huge.
According to the data used in the study, only 52% of American high school dropouts report voting. But that number climbs steadily with every year of school. It hits 67% for high school graduates, 74% for people with some college, and a towering 84% for college graduates.
So in the United States, your educational attainment is practically a gold ticket to the ballot box. It predicts your participation with stunning accuracy.
It scales perfectly.
Yeah.
But then you take the exact same analytical framework and you look across the Atlantic Ocean to the United Kingdom, and the entire education effect just vanishes into thin air.
It disappears entirely.
Completely flatlines. In the UK, 85% of people who dropped out of school at the absolute minimum legal age of 14 turn out to vote.
85%.
Right. And what about the highly educated? The people who stayed in school until age 18, went to university, and earned degrees. They vote at 84%.
I really want the listener to deeply digest those numbers. 85% for a 14-year-old dropout. 84% for a postgraduate. The dropouts are actually voting 1% more often than the highly educated elites.
The playing field is entirely flat. A university degree in the United Kingdom barely moves the needle on whether or not you show up on election day.
But how is that logically possible? I mean, we just spent the first half of this deep dive proving that education has this massive causal effect on behavior in the U.S.
We did.
Why does crossing the Atlantic Ocean suddenly erase the democratic power of a diploma? Are British schools just utterly failing to teach their kids how to care about their country?
No, the schools are not the problem at all. The revelation here, this massive hidden variable, has nothing to do with what happens inside the classroom.
Okay, what is it then?
The difference between these two nations comes down to what happens before you are even legally permitted to cast your ballot. It is the brutal, mind-numbing reality of voter registration.
Oh, man. The paperwork.
The administrative obstacle course. Let's compare the two systems as they existed when this data was collected, because the philosophical difference is staggering.
Okay, break it down.
In the United States, the entire burden of registration is placed squarely on the shoulders of the individual citizen. You are entirely responsible for figuring out the system. You have to locate the specific rules for your specific state. You have to figure out the deadlines, which might arbitrarily be set a full month before the actual election takes place.
Yeah.
You have to locate the correct regional office. You might have to physically transport yourself there during specific working hours, right in the middle of your own shift at work.
Let me build an analogy for this, because every single American has felt this specific type of pain.
Go for it.
It is exactly like dealing with the DMV or filing complex tax forms. You move to a new apartment, just one zip code over. You're incredibly busy trying to unpack, trying to pay rent. You forget to proactively notify the government and update your voter file.
It happens all the time.
Election day rolls around, you show up at your old polling place, and you are handed a provisional ballot that has a high likelihood of just being thrown in the trash.
Yeah.
The system demands constant, proactive administrative maintenance from you.
That is exactly the American philosophy. If you want to exercise your right, you must navigate the maze. Now, it is worth noting that the U.S. did try to ease this burden later on. Over the years, states added mail-in registration options. In 1993, the federal government passed the National Voter Registration Act, heavily known as the Motor Voter Law, which allowed people to register while renewing their driver's licenses.
Right, I remember that.
But even with those modernizations, the foundational architecture remains the exact same. The citizen must initiate the action.
So that is the U.S. obstacle course. How does the U.K. handle it? Because they clearly aren't demanding this level of hustle from their dropouts if they're voting at 85%.
In the United Kingdom, the government registers you. The burden is on the state, not the citizen.
Wow.
This is a tradition dating all the way back to the Representation of the People Act in 1918. The responsibility to maintain an accurate electoral register rests with local government officials. Every single year, an electoral registration officer proactively sends a form to every single residential household in the country. You simply have to list who lives there.
But I know human nature. People ignore mail all the time. What happens if I just toss that form in the kitchen trash can?
The government does not let it go. They send a follow-up reminder.
Okay.
If you continue to ignore the paperwork, a government official will physically travel to your home and knock on your door to follow up.
They literally show up at your house.
Yes. And if you refuse to fill it out, or if you attempt to give false information about who lives in the house, the government has the authority to slap you with a fine of up to £1,000.
£1,000.
Okay.
For not filling out a voting form.
Yes. The British system operates on a very different philosophy. You maintain the absolute right to abstain from voting on Election Day. You can stay home.
Right. They don't force you to vote.
Exactly. But you do not have the right to ignore the registration process. As a direct result of this proactive, highly enforced, state-driven system, only about 5.9% of the British electorate remains unregistered.
That is practically statistical noise. The government is essentially dragging the entire population onto the voter rolls, whether they ask for it or not.
Precisely. The friction has been completely removed. And this systemic difference provided the researchers with the key to unlocking the American data.
How so?
They had a hypothesis. What if that massive voting gap in the U.S. isn't because high school dropouts are fundamentally apathetic? What if it's purely because they lack the administrative skills to navigate the registration maze?
Ah, so they ran the American numbers again?
They reran the U.S. data, but this time they introduced a filter. They restricted the data pool to look only at people who had already successfully managed to get their names onto the voter registration rolls.
So they basically statistically leveled the playing field to match the UK.
Exactly. And the collapse of the data is staggering. Think back to that massive 15 percentage point voting gap between U.S. high school dropouts and high school graduates that we saw in the full sample.
Right. It's 52% for dropouts versus 67% for graduates. A huge canyon.
When you filter the pool and only look at registered voters, that canyon completely collapses. It drops to just a 5 percentage point difference.
Wait, 2/3 of the gap just evaporates.
It evaporates. Even when you look at the extreme ends of the spectrum, comparing high school dropouts all the way to college graduates, the gap violently shrinks from 32 points down to just 10 points.
That is insane.
The researchers then applied their rigorous instrumental variables, those compulsory schooling laws we mapped out earlier, and found the exact same pattern. The true causal effect of an extra year of schooling on the physical act of voting drops to less than a third of its original size once you account for the hurdle of registration.
Think about the massive societal implication of what you just said. It completely upends how we judge non-voters in America.
It changes everything.
We have this pervasive cultural narrative that blames non-voters for being lazy, for not caring about the direction of their country, for being uniquely apathetic. But the data shows they are just being outmaneuvered by bureaucracy.
It acts as a highly effective, invisible filter.
The filter is paperwork. Education isn't just teaching you how a bill becomes a law or memorizing the three branches of government. Education is secretly giving you the administrative stamina to navigate red tape.
Administrative stamina, that's a great way to put it.
It trains your brain to track complex deadlines, to read dense forms without panicking, to figure out how to interact with the regional office. School basically trains you to endure bureaucracy.
Yes, exactly.
And if you didn't get a decade of that specific training because you dropped out to work in a factory, the voter registration system defeats you before the candidates even start debating.
You have articulated exactly what political scientists call the civic skills or resources model of participation. Economists view it as a specific form of human capital.
Right.
The less formal education you have, the higher the invisible cost of voting becomes for you. Overcoming those bureaucratic hurdles requires a massive, disproportionate amount of relative effort, time, and knowledge compared to a college graduate who fills out complex forms for a living.
They do it every day at work.
Exactly. And frankly, the researchers note that procrastination plays a significant role. If you are not heavily practiced at planning complex tasks months in advance, something higher education relentlessly drills into you, you simply miss the deadline.
It is a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It makes the system look incredibly predatory, filtering out the voices of the working class through sheer administrative exhaustion.
It really does.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable question about the other side of the Atlantic. If the UK's automatic registration system levels the playing field so perfectly that a 14-year-old dropout votes just as frequently as a guy with a PhD, does education in the UK do anything at all for citizenship?
That is the exact enigma the researchers had to confront.
I mean, if you don't need a degree to figure out how to vote in Britain, is the British school system just completely useless at building citizens? Are they just churning out millions of people who vote mechanically because the government forces them onto the rolls, but who have literally no idea what they're actually voting for?
The researchers recognized that if they only looked at the raw act of voting, the picture would be dangerously incomplete.
Okay.
Voting is incredibly important, obviously, but it is a very narrow, binary definition of civic participation. You pull a lever once every few years.
Right. There's more to politics than just the booth.
Exactly. So to understand what education was actually doing in the UK, they turned to another massive, highly detailed data set. It's called the Eurobarometer surveys.
The Eurobarometer. Break that down for us. What exactly is this data set?
It is an incredible sociological resource. These are comprehensive surveys designed specifically to track opinions, social attitudes, and daily behaviors across European citizens. And crucially, they are conducted frequently, often more than once a year.
It's a very steady stream of data.
Very steady. The researchers combined 50 of these individual surveys spanning a massive timeline from 1973 all the way to 1998, creating a robust sample of over 63,000 individuals across Britain and Northern Ireland.
And what specific behaviors were they hunting for in this data?
They were looking for the quality of civic life, rather than just the quantity of voters. They wanted to know what happens between elections.
Right.
The Eurobarometer asks highly specific, fascinating questions about daily political interaction. For example, when you hold a strong opinion, do you ever find yourself persuading your friends, relatives, or fellow workers to share your views?
Ooh, I like that.
Or another one, when you get together with friends, would you say you discuss political matters frequently, occasionally, or never?
I really love the texture of these questions. This isn't about dutifully filling out a ballot in a silent booth. This is about being the person at the pub who has a pint in their hand and will absolutely not stop talking about the local zoning laws.
Exactly. It measures active, daily, interpersonal engagement, and to ensure they were capturing true causation and not just the habits of naturally outgoing people, they applied their instrumental variable test here as well.
Okay, remind us what that means in this context.
Yeah. They isolated the specific cohorts of British teenagers who were forced into that extra year of school by the 1947 and 1972 laws.
Right, the kids who tried to leave but were forced back to their desks by the government.
Exactly. And the findings from those specific cohorts are definitive. Education in the UK didn't increase the sheer quantity of voters because the government registration system had already maxed that metric out.
Right.
But it fundamentally, radically reshaped the behavior of those voters. Those teenagers who were forced into an extra year of school were significantly more likely to engage in deep, combative civic behaviors as adults.
Give me the actual impact. How much did an extra year change them?
The forced extra year of schooling made them 7 percentage points more likely to report that they actively try to persuade their friends, relatives, or coworkers to adopt their political views.
Wow, 7 points is a lot.
It is. There were 6 percentage points more likely to frequently discuss political matters with friends, and they were 3 percentage points more likely to explicitly label themselves as politically active.
Incredible.
Furthermore, the researchers found that accumulating 4 additional years of school raised the probability of a person watching the daily news by a solid 3 percentage points.
I want to dig into the gears of this. Why does sitting in a classroom doing algebra and reading Shakespeare make you more likely to argue with your coworker about politics 2 decades later?
It comes down to a concept economists call lowering the cost of information.
The cost of information. Give me a real-world scenario for that.
Think about the mental effort required to read a dense 20-page political platform, or trying to understand a complex parliamentary debate about inflation rates and supply chains.
It's exhausting.
Right. If you have very low educational attainment, comprehending that dense information requires a massive expenditure of mental energy, focus, and time. It is exhausting. The cost to your brain is incredibly high.
Yeah.
So you avoid it.
It makes total sense.
But education equips you with advanced cognitive skills, reading comprehension, and a baseline scaffolding of history and economics. It makes absorbing new, complex political information much cheaper and easier for your brain to process.
So because the friction of understanding the news is gone, you're vastly more likely to actually consume it. You watch the nightly broadcasts, you read the broadsheet newspapers instead of just the tabloids. And because you are absorbing that information effortlessly, you start forming stronger, more defined opinions.
Yes, and crucially, it gives you the vocabulary and the confidence to articulate those opinions out loud. You transition from being a passive observer of the system to an active participant.
You actually jump into the ring.
You do. You possess the cognitive tools and the rhetorical confidence to debate your coworker by the water cooler or to try and persuade your aunt during a tense family dinner.
Think about your own friend group for a second, right? We all have that one person in the group chat who is constantly dropping links to news articles, who's always trying to rally everyone to their side of whatever the current issue is. The data strongly suggests that specific personality trait, that willingness to debate and persuade, is heavily tethered to how long they sat in a formal classroom. Education didn't just teach them the capital of France. It gave them the cognitive confidence to become a political actor in their daily lives.
And it is worth noting a very important methodological caution the researchers introduce here, drawing on nuanced work by economists Marianne Bertrand and Senthil Mullainathan. They highlight the danger of mixing action outcomes with subjective outcomes.
What is the difference between the two?
An action outcome is something you physically did. Did you vote? Do you watch the news every night? Do you attend meetings?
Part facts.
Right. A subjective outcome is how you feel. Do you consider yourself politically active? The danger with subjective questions on surveys is that it requires mental resources just to form an abstract opinion about yourself.
Oh, I see.
Sometimes people with less education will give an unconsidered soft opinion just to get the surveyor off the phone, an opinion they might instantly abandon if they thought about it for 5 more minutes.
Because it's easier to just say sure than to evaluate your own identity.
Exactly. The researchers acknowledge that highly educated people might just be better at instantly forming and defending these abstract, subjective opinions on the fly, which could slightly skew the results for questions like, do you consider yourself active?
Right, yeah.
However, because the researchers also see massive, undeniable movement in the hard action outcomes, like physically debating a coworker or tuning into the news broadcast, they remain highly confident that the overall cognitive upgrade effect is entirely real and powerful.
So the narrative is clear. Education fundamentally upgrades the operating system of a citizen, making them more engaged, more persuasive, more mentally active in the civic space.
Yes.
That completely solves the British enigma. But I want to drag this back across the Atlantic to the United States. If education gives you this massive cognitive boost, how does that alter your actual fundamental view of American society?
That question brings us to the final and, frankly, the most profound layer of this entire data set. We move beyond voting beyond arguing at the pub, and look at the actual fabric of society.
Because what if the ultimate superpower of education isn't just getting you to pull a lever in a voting booth? What if the real return on investment is keeping the entire society from tearing itself apart?
It sounds dramatic, but the American data actively supports the gravity of that statement.
Mhm.
The researchers returned to the U.S. National Election Studies data to look for broader civic externalities, these massive hidden benefits to keeping kids from dropping out.
And what behaviors did they uncover?
They found that high school graduates, compared directly to dropouts, are actively sustaining the physical infrastructure of their local communities. The data demonstrates they are significantly more likely to follow local political campaigns on television and in print.
Which perfectly aligns with the cost of information theory. It's mentally cheaper for them to track what the mayoral candidates are doing.
It does, but it goes far beyond just consuming media. The graduates are vastly more likely to physically attend local community meetings. They're far more likely to volunteer their personal time to work on local community issues. They're putting their physical bodies into the civic space.
They're doing the absolutely unglamorous, tedious work of democracy, the Tuesday night town halls, the zoning board hearings, the PTA meetings, the stuff that actually keeps a town running.
They are maintaining the system. And perhaps most surprisingly, the researchers looked at subjective attitudes toward the government itself, how these citizens actually feel about the people in power.
Okay, what is the verdict?
The data reveals that high school graduates are significantly more likely to state that they actively trust the federal government. And conversely, they're substantially less likely to believe that federal officials are crooked or corrupt.
Hold on, I have to push back hard on this.
Go ahead.
Going to high school makes you trust politicians more. That feels incredibly anti-intuitive, especially right now. Look at the modern political climate. Honestly, sometimes it feels like the more you read about politics, the more you understand the lobbying and the backroom deals, the more cynical and distrustful you become. Are educated people just statistically more naive?
It is a massive counterintuitive finding, and it always shocks people when they see the numbers. But you have to analyze it through the framework of engagement versus alienation.
Engagement versus alienation. Okay, map that out for me.
Consider what the government looks like to someone with very low educational attainment. If you do not possess the baseline knowledge of how a massive bureaucracy operates, if it seems like an opaque, confusing labyrinth where rules are arbitrary, where decisions fall out of the sky, and where you have zero personal power, your default psychological defense mechanism is going to be intense cynicism.
You just shut down.
You become alienated. You naturally assume that everyone running the machine is fundamentally crooked because the outcomes don't make sense to you and you have no agency to affect them.
It's like watching a magic trick where your wallet disappears. If I don't understand the mechanics of the trick, I don't assume the magician is just following complex rules. I assume he's just a thief.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
If you don't understand the rules of the game, you assume the referees are entirely corrupt.
Wow.
But when you receive the education necessary to understand the actual mechanisms of government, how a bill is drafted, how a budget committee operates, the complex checks and balances of the courts, the system loses its terrifying opacity. It becomes legible.
You can read the Matrix.
Exactly. You might completely, vehemently disagree with the policies being passed, but you understand the process by which they were passed.
And because you understand the process, you recognize where the levers of power actually are. You realize you can actually pull them.
Yes, you realize that organizing a petition or showing up to a community meeting with 20 angry neighbors actually has a mechanical effect on the system. You have agency.
That changes everything.
So you are statistically more likely to place a baseline level of trust in the fundamental structure of the government, rather than cynically assuming the entire enterprise is just a shadowy conspiracy. Education systematically replaces blind alienation with critical engagement.
That is a staggering insight. Education eradicates the deep, systemic ignorance that breeds pure, destructive cynicism. It keeps citizens tethered to the reality of the system, keeping them engaged in the messy work of fixing it, rather than just giving up and letting it rot.
And that profound realization brings us to the final narrative payoff of this entire study. The researchers calculated an ultimate counterfactual that proves just how existentially vital public education has been to the basic survival of the American system over the last half-century.
This is the sinking boat. Let's lay out the numbers.
Let's circle all the way back to the glaring historical paradox we used to open this deep dive. Between 1964 and 2000, high school graduation rates in the U.S. soared by 36 percentage points. But voter turnout dropped from 63% down to 49%.
The math that made no sense. Education went up, participation went down.
The researchers utilized their massive data set and their rigorously tested causal models to calculate a terrifying alternate reality. They asked a simple question. What if that education boom had never occurred?
What if it just didn't happen?
What if the high school attainment rate in America had stayed completely frozen at its lower 1964 levels, while all the other cultural shifts of the late 20th century still happened?
What happens to the American voter turnout in that timeline?
Holding all other demographic and social factors constant, the researchers predict that U.S. voter turnout in the year 2000 would have been an additional 10 to 12 percentage points lower than the 49% it actually hit.
Wait, let me do that math. It wouldn't have been 49%. It would have plummeted into the high 30s. A national election where over 60% of the country just stays home.
Yes. The massive drop in civic participation over those 4 decades was caused by a myriad of complex, overlapping social and political factors. Vietnam, Watergate, economic shifts, things entirely outside the scope of this particular study.
Right, massive cultural wave.
But public education wasn't failing to stop the drop. Public education was actively, desperately fighting against it.
Education was basically bailing water out of a sinking boat. The boat of American civic participation was taking on massive amounts of water from dozens of different societal leaks. But the massive subsidized expansion of public education was a giant bucket, constantly bailing that water out year after year, graduate after graduate.
That's exactly what was happening.
If we had not forced those generations to stay in the classroom, the boat wouldn't have just taken on water. It would have completely capsized. Education has been keeping the democratic system afloat against a crushing tide of apathy and alienation.
The positive externalities of education, the collateral benefits that Adam Smith and Milton Friedman theorized about centuries ago, are massively, undeniably real. The data proves it. The education system just had an unbelievable amount of heavy lifting to do to keep the country stable.
This has been an absolutely wild journey through the data, and we really need to summarize the core revelations before we wrap up. We started with a historical impossibility-packed graduation stages and empty voting booths.
Right.
We learned how economists use forced natural experiments, like trapping 14-year-olds in a British classroom in 1947, or analyzing the chaotic school laws of the American South, to prove that education actually causes a change in human behavior, eliminating all the invisible variables of good parenting or inherent ambition.
We also entirely debunked the long-held academic myth that educated elites lie more on surveys to protect their image. By painstakingly checking official government records in the 70s and 80s, the researchers proved the survey data is fundamentally sound. Educated people actually lie less about voting.
Which is still crazy to me. Then we hit the massive face-slapping twist. The revelation that the massive voting gap between American high school dropouts and college graduates is largely a mirage created by the voter registration wall.
The paperwork filter.
Exactly. 2/3 of the perceived education effect instantly vanishes when you look only at people who successfully navigated the bureaucratic nightmare of getting on the rolls. Meanwhile, in the UK, where the government hunts you down to register you under threat of a massive fine, the playing field is completely flat. A dropout votes just as often as a PhD.
But we also learned that even when the voting playing field is flat, the classroom works its magic in deeper, more complex ways. In the UK, education fuels the daily life of democracy, increasing the frequency of political persuasion, debate, and active engagement by lowering the mental cost of consuming complex information.
And finally, we saw how in the United States, that exact same cognitive upgrade increases foundational social trust, drives citizens to tedious town hall meetings, and literally prevented the American electoral system from completely bottoming out into the 30% range over the last half of the 20th century.
It is a rigorous mathematical testament to the unseen power of the classroom.
It really changes how you look at a high school. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to ponder as we end this session, something that builds on the reality of the data we just explored. Think deeply about the American registration wall.
It's a huge barrier.
We know, for an absolute mathematical fact, that if you manage to get registered in the U.S., the massive 15-point voting gap between a high school dropout and a high school graduate violently collapses down to just 5 points. Now, I want you to imagine a world where the United States adopted the United Kingdom's proactive registration system tomorrow morning.
Every single eligible American citizen automatically placed on the voter rolls by the state with zero friction and zero paperwork required on their end.
Millions of Americans, specifically millions of working-class Americans without college degrees, the exact people currently filtered out by the complex forms, the arbitrary deadlines, and the confusing regional offices, would instantly wake up with absolute friction-free access to the polls.
The demographic composition of the voting public would experience a seismic overnight shift.
It would be an absolute political earthquake. Think about how that would dramatically upend the entire political landscape. What kind of politicians would suddenly start winning elections?
The platforms would completely change.
What kind of policies, minimum wage, healthcare, labor laws, would suddenly be forced onto the national agenda? It's the bottom tiers of educational attainment suddenly voted at 85%, matching the rates of the wealthy and the highly educated.
It would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the country, completely reshaping who the government listens to.
And when you realize just how massive that shift in power would be, when you realize exactly who benefits from millions of dropouts staying home, you have to ask yourself an incredibly uncomfortable question. Is the bureaucratic, confusing, exhausting maze of U.S. voter registration really just a clunky accident of history? Or is it being kept exactly the way it is on purpose?
That is the big question.
Next time someone points to a chart showing that less educated people don't vote and tries to tell you it's just a clean, simple diagnosis of working-class apathy, you'll know the truth. You'll know they're entirely missing the giant, invisible wall of paperwork standing right in front of the ballot box. Keep questioning the data, and we will see you on the next deep dive.